Chapter 3.8. Most wonderfully, this psychosis addressing and solving real explanation of the human condition makes possible the psychological rehabilitation of the human race. What is so utterly exonerating and psychologically healing about our ability to understand the human condition now is that we can finally appreciate that there was a very good reason for our angry, alienated, and egocentric lives. In fact, we can now see why our species has not just been egocentric, but ego-infuriated, even ego gone mad with murderous rage for having to live with so much unjust criticism or guilt for some 2 million years. At long last, we have the reason for humans' capacity for shocking acts of cruelty, sadism, hate, murder, and warfare. We now know the source of the dark volcanic forces in us humans. And no wonder we led such an evasive, escapist, superficial and artificial, greedy, smother ourselves with material glory while we lack the spiritual glory of compassionate understanding of ourselves, power, fame, and fortune-seeking existence. Yes, it was the accumulation of money or capital that served to supply the symbolic winds we needed to counter the insecurity of our seemingly worthless condition. And indeed, the so-called 7 deadly sins of the human condition, of lust, anger, pride, envy, covetousness, gluttony and sloth, are all just different manifestations of the 3 fundamental upsets of anger, egocentricity and alienation that unavoidably emerged when humans became fully conscious and had to set out in search of knowledge in the presence of unjustly condemning instincts. And with the ability now to explain and understand that we are actually all good and not bad, the upset that resulted from not being able to explain the source of our divisive condition is able to subside and disappear. Finding understanding of the human condition is what rehabilitates and transforms the human race from its psychologically upset, angry, egocentric, and alienated condition. The word psychiatry literally means soul healing, derived as it is from psyche, meaning soul, and aitreia, which according to the Encyclopedic World Dictionary means healing. But never before have we been able to heal our soul, explain to our original instinctive self or soul that our fully conscious, thinking self is good and not bad, and by so doing reconcile and heal our split selves. As Professor Harry Prosen has said about the psychological effect of this all-loving, all-compassionate understanding of ourselves, I have no doubt this biological explanation of the human condition is the holy grail of insight we have sought for the psychological rehabilitation of the human race. Yes, our ability now to understand the dark side of ourselves means we can finally achieve the wholeness for humans that Carl Jung was forever pointing out depends on the ability to own our own shadow. Sir Lawrence van der Post was also describing the understanding that was required to heal our species' corrupted, fallen condition when he wrote that true love is love of the difficult and unlovable, and how can there ever be any real beginning without forgiveness, and that only by understanding how we were all part of the same contemporary pattern of wars, cruelty, greed and indifference could we defeat those dark forces with a true understanding of their nature and origin, and that compassion leaves an indelible blueprint on the recognition that life so sorely needs between one individual and another, one nation and another, one culture and another. It is also valid for the road which our spirit should be building now for crossing the historical abyss that separates us from a truly contemporary vision of life, and the increase of life and meaning that awaits us in the future. Yes, one day there had to be, to quote the Rolling Stones lyrics, sympathy for the devil, One day we had to find the reconciling, compassionate, healing understanding of the dark side of human nature. One day the marriage of heaven and hell, as William Blake titled his famous 1790 book, had to occur. This explanation is immensely positively reinforcing and thus therapeutic, because we can now understand that humans are nothing less than the heroes of the story of life on earth. This is the fundamental truth that, as I said in chapter 2.8, we humans hoped and believed we would one day establish, and now have. Despite all appearances to the contrary, despite our anger, egocentricity and alienation, humans are the most wonderful beings. In fact, if there is a word such as divine that can be applied to mortals, then we can now see that it truly does belong to us humans. Because to withstand 2 million years of the injustice that we have had to endure, and still be on our feet, still be able to laugh, still be able to smack each other in the back with encouragement, still be able to carry on, get out of bed each day and face life under the duress of the human condition, we must be the most magnificent of organisms. Truly, as Camus wrote in 1944, man's greatness lies in his decision to be stronger than his condition. To not give in to the possibility he famously described in his 1942 essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, that there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life, under the duress of the human condition, is or is not worth living. This fact of the utter magnificence of the human race, that we can now understand and know is true, rather than merely hope it is so, brings such intense relief to our angst-ridden cells, limbs and torsos that it will feel as though we have thrown off a shroud of heavy chains. The great, heavy burden of guilt has finally been lifted from the shoulders of humans. Yes, doesn't the core feeling exist in all humans that far from being meaningless, banishment-deserving, evil blights on this planet, we are all immense heroes? Doesn't this explanation at last make sense of all humans' immensely courageous and defiant attitude? And won't this explanation bring deep, bone-draining relief to the whole of each person's being? Yes, this explanation, this understanding of the human condition, provides the insight we have sought for the psychological rehabilitation of the human race, as Professor Prosen said it would. It enables us to see that our divisive human nature was not an unchangeable or immutable state, as many people came to believe it is, and which E.O. Wilson's multi-level selection theory for eusociality deems it to be, but the result of the human condition, our inability to understand ourselves, and, as such, it can dissipate now that we have found that understanding. Importantly, this understanding of why we became upset as a species doesn't condone or sanction evil. Rather, through bringing understanding to humans' upset behaviour, it gives us the power to ameliorate and thus subside and ultimately eliminate it. Evil, humans' divisive behaviour, was a result of a conflict and insecurity within us that arose from the dilemma of the human condition. So once you resolve the dilemma, you end the conflict and insecurity. Peace could only come to our troubled, divisive state and world through removing the underlying insecurity of our condition. With our ego or sense of self-worth satisfied at the most fundamental level, our anger can now subside, and all our denials and resulting alienation can be dismantled. From having lived in a dark, cave-like, depressed state of condemnation, and, as a result, had to repress, hide, and deny our true selves, we can at last, as the 1960s rock musical Hair sang, let the sunshine in. end our horrid existence of having to depend on denial to cope. The compassionate, understanding-based psychological rehabilitation of the human race, the transformation of all humans, truly can begin. Yes, finally, at last, we can, as Jim Morrison hoped when, as mentioned earlier, he sang of standing there on freedom's shore, waiting for the sun, waiting to tell me what went wrong, have day destroy the night and break on through to the other side, to a sound world free of alienated denial. A detailed description of how the transformation of the human race is now able to take place, such that every human can now immediately be free of the human condition, is presented in the concluding chapter 9 of this book. As for the veracity of this explanation, it is precisely this explanation's ability to at last make relieving sense of human life, of all our behaviour, in fact, that lets us know that we have finally found the true explanation of the human condition. The great physicist Albert Einstein once wrote that truth is what stands the test of experience. And since this study and explanation is all about us, about our behaviour, we are in a position to personally experience its validity, to know if it's true or not. As a subject of this study, we can know if the ideas being put forward work or not, if these explanations do make sense of our deepest feelings, of our volcanic anger, of our lonely estranged souls, of our insecure state, yet core belief that we are wonderful beings, etc., etc., as, in fact, they do. Moreover, these explanations are so powerfully insightful, accountable, and revealing, so true, that they render our lives transparent. A transparency, a sudden exposure, that can initially be overwhelmingly confronting and depressing. But there is a way, an absolutely wonderful, joyous way, to cope with the arrival of Exposure Day, or Transparency Day, or Revelation Day, or Truth Day, or Honesty Day. In fact, the long-feared so-called Judgment Day, which is actually not a time of condemning judgment, but of compassionate understanding. And that wonderful way of coping with the arrival of the all-liberating, all-rehabilitating, but at the same time all-exposing truth about us humans is, as stated above, the subject of the concluding chapter, chapter 9 in this book. But the point being made here is that the transparency of our lives that these explanations bring reveals just how effective, how penetrating, and therefore how truthful these understandings actually are. So, we can see that as dishonest as it necessarily was in its approach, mechanistic reductionist science turns out to be the liberator of humanity, the proverbial messiah or saviour of humanity, for it has finally enabled us to lift the so-called burden of guilt from the human race. It found understanding of the difference in the way nerves and genes process information, that one is insightful and the other isn't, which has finally made it possible to explain that greatest of all mysteries, that holy grail of all human conscious thought and inquiry of the human condition. As was mentioned in paragraph 245, the fundamental conflict involved in our condition between our innocent instinctive self and our conscious self was described as far back as when Genesis was written by Moses, and Plato presented his allegory of the two-horse chariot. But we couldn't explain that conflicted state until science found understanding of the different ways genes and nerves process information. Significantly, now that we are able to understand from scientific first principles that upset is not an evil, worthless, bad state, but an immensely heroic state, we can know that while inevitably all humans are variously upset from their different encounters with and degrees of engagement in humanity's epic search to find knowledge, all humans are equally good. Everyone is variously angry, egocentric and alienated, but everyone is good. And not just good, but a hero of the story of life on Earth. No longer does humanity have to rely on dogmatic assertions that all men are created equal purely on the basis that it is a self-evident truth, as the United States Declaration of Independence asserts, because we can now explain, understand and know that the equality of goodness of all humans is a fundamental truth. We can now understand why everyone is equally worthy, and that no one is superior or inferior, and that everyone deserves the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Indeed, through this understanding, the whole concept of good and bad disappears from our conceptualization of ourselves. Compassionate, relieving truth and honesty about humans has finally arrived. Religions have taught us that God loves you, and while that mantra has been comforting, ultimately we needed to understand why we were lovable. Again, the issue of who or what God is will be addressed in more detail in chapter 4.3. Similarly, the Bible states that the truth will set you free. And while we know this statement to be true, the problem has been that all the partial truths, such as that humans are the most brutal and destructive animals to ever walk the earth, condemned our upset state, fueling it further, which means that ultimately, for the truth to genuinely set us free, it had to be the full truth that explains why humans are all good and not bad. Yes, the human condition is certainly shot through with paradox. To become happy, we had to first endure unhappiness. We appeared to be bad, but believe we were good. We are intelligent, smart and clever, but, by all appearances, behave in such an unintelligent, stupid way that we have brought the world to the brink of destruction. But most wonderfully, we at last have the understanding that reconciles not just these, but all the polarities of life that existed under the duress of the human condition, between good and evil, instinct and intellect, emotion and reason, conscience and conscious, ignorance and wisdom, soul and mind, heart and head, I feel and I think, yin and yang, light and dark, the innocent and the corrupted, the unembattled and the battle-hardened, the selfless and the selfish, the happy and the upset, the light-hearted and the heavy-hearted, the cooperative and the competitive, the integrative and the divisive, the godly and the ungodly, the gentle and the aggressive, the loving and the hateful, the sound and the alienated, the secure and the insecure, the honest and the dishonest, the natural and the artificial, the non-sexual and the sexual. Sex as humans practice it is explained in chapter 8.11b. Altruism and egotism, idealism and realism, spiritualism and materialism, socialism and capitalism, left wing and right wing, instinctualism and intellectualism, religion and science, holism and mechanism, young and old, women and men. The different roles of women and men under the duress of the human condition is also explained in chapter 8.11b. Blacks and whites, the differences and upset between races is explained in chapter 8.16e. Unresigned and resigned, country and city, etc., etc., etc. The explanation of the human condition unravels and makes sense of the whole seemingly impenetrable and insoluble confusion of human life, and does so in such a simple and obvious way that it brings to mind Huxley's famous response to Darwin's idea of natural selection. How extremely stupid of me not to have thought of that. Yes, we have at last found the understandoscope for human behaviour. Chapter 3.9 The End of Politics. Most wonderfully, with this understanding, everyone can come in from the cold, from their lonely outposts of bewilderment about what has actually been going on in the world of humans. The result is that immense and urgently needed fundamental change can now occur for the human race. Conflict from misunderstanding especially goes. For instance, this explanation obsoletes the conflict between the philosophically opposed left and right wings of politics, because we can now understand that while giving in to our ideal behaviour demanding instincts, flying back on course, in the Adam Stalk analogy, was an immensely guilt-relieving exercise that made us feel good, the left-wing approach. It was fundamentally irresponsible because it meant abandoning humanity's upsetting but necessary search for knowledge, the right-wing approach. The truth was not as it appeared. Participating in humanity's selfish, aggressive and competitive battle to find knowledge was not the bad transgression it had been condemned as. Rather, it was the responsible course of action and thus a good thing. The paradox of the situation was marvellously summed up in the musical Man of La Mancha, when, as mentioned in paragraph 68, it says we had to be prepared to march into hell for a heavenly cause. Yes, we had to, as it were, lose ourselves to find ourselves. Suffering upset was the heroic price we had to pay to find understanding, ultimately self-understanding, and, with it, freedom from the upset state of the human condition. So while the left wing has had an absolute field day demonising the right wing's support of the non-ideal state, even labelling it evil, as was proselytised by the left-wing activist Michael Moore in his 2009 film Capitalism, A Love Story, we can now see that it was the philosophy of the left that was morally bankrupt, void of meaning in the sense that, while siding with idealism made its practitioners feel good, it ultimately had no relevance in humanity's critical journey from ignorance to enlightenment. Proponents of the left-wing approach were deluding themselves that they were holding the moral high ground, when in fact the reverse was true. Their stridently pseudo-idealistic, dogmatic, condemning, ridiculing, escapist, deluded, arrogant, dishonest culture oppressed progress towards humanity's liberation from the human condition, stymieing the return of the genuinely peaceful, ideal world. Karl Marx, the political theorist whose mid-19th century ideas gave rise to socialism and communism, was very wrong when he asserted in his 1845 book, Thesis on Feuerbach, that the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is not to understand the world, but to change it, just make it cooperative or social or communal. The whole point and responsibility of being a conscious being is to understand our world and our place in it, ultimately to find understanding of our seemingly horribly flawed human condition. In short, pseudo-idealism demands that we just be ideal, don't think about why we are not ideal, in fact, don't go anywhere near the issue of self, namely the issue of the human condition. Just pretend there is no human condition that has to be understood, and that all humans need to do to fix up their world is behave ideally. It is an attitude of total delusion and complete dishonesty. The immense danger of pseudo-idealistic left-wing thinking was that the longer the upsetting search for knowledge went on without the goal of that search of the true psychologically relieving explanation of the human condition being found, the more people became upset sufferers of the human condition, and the more they couldn't resist the artificial, feel-good relief offered by the left wing's dogmatic, anti-knowledge, pseudo-idealistic, deluded, dishonest, fly-back-on-course way of living. And in contriving the multi-level selection theory for human behaviour, E.O. Wilson furnished the whole dumbing down process with the ultimate delusion it needed of a biological, non-explanation nullification of the core, critical, all-important issue of the human condition itself, thereby virtually locking humanity onto a path to terminal dishonesty, dogma, or phoniness, or fakeness, or alienation, or darkness, or extinction. As the author George Orwell famously predicted in his 1949 book 1984, if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever, stamping forever on the freedom that humans' extraordinary and unique conscious mind needs to search for knowledge. The impact of this pseudo-idealistic development on the democratic process is grim indeed, because democracy, in which the proper balance is sought between the need to maintain a degree of selfless, loving, soulful, cooperative ideal behaviour for society to function, and the need for there to be sufficient freedom from the imposition of the expectation of such ideal behaviour for people to be able to carry on the corrupting search for knowledge, is destroyed as an effective and meaningful process when people start voting for idealism, not because there is too much selfishness in society, but simply because it makes them feel good. We can now at last appreciate that when we vote this way, we are not participating in the true democratic process that human advancement has been dependent upon. We are exploiting and subverting it. And while many people think that even if feel-good pseudo-idealism is not a real form of idealism, it is surely harmless. That is most certainly not the case. No, it is extremely bloody-minded, totally selfish, and dangerously destructive behaviour that says, I no longer care about the human race, only about finding personal relief from my human condition. Of course, such behaviour was always going to develop when the levels of upset in society reached unbearable heights, because at that end-play point the need for relief from the agony of the human condition was going to become the only concern amongst an ever-increasing proportion of the population, with the dire consequence that democracy would fail to find the proper balance because the human race indifferent, deluded, feel-good, pseudo-idealistic left-wing political attitude would become impossible to defeat in an election, leading to the human race suffering a horrifically alienated death by dogma. Certainly, the upset behaviour that results from right-wing participation in humanity's heroic search for knowledge is increasingly bringing about immense human suffering and environmental devastation. But it is the knowledge-oppressing left wing that poses the real threat to the survival of the human race, because only through successfully completing that search for knowledge could humanity be liberated from the upset state of the human condition. So, while, as the journalist Geoffrey Wheatcroft recognised in his 1999 newspaper article, the great twin political problems of the age are the brutality of the right and the dishonesty of the left. It is not the brutality of the right, but the dishonesty of the left that stands like a colossal ogre over the human race, threatening to destroy it. Yes, we can now appreciate that the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche spoke the truth about the need for humanity to hold its nerve when he wrote in his 1892 book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that there have always been many sickly people among those who invent fables and long for God, ideality. They have a raging hate for the enlightened man and for that youngest of virtues which is called honesty. Purer and more honest of speech is the healthy body, perfect and square-built, and it speaks of the meaning of the earth, which is to fight for knowledge, ultimately self-knowledge, understanding the human condition. You are not yet free. You still search for freedom. Your search has fatigued you, but by my love and hope I entreat you, do not reject the hero in your soul. Keep holy your highest hope. War, against the oppression of dogma, and courage have done more great things than charity. Not your pity, but your bravery has saved the unfortunate up to now. What warrior wants to be spared? I do not spare you. I love you from the very heart, my brothers in war. Yes, as stated in paragraph 281, you had to be brave to avoid the temptation of giving up the self-corrupting search for knowledge. Nietzsche also spoke the truth about the great danger of pseudo-idealism when he said in his 1886 book, Beyond Good and Evil, "There comes a time in a culture's history when it becomes so pathologically soft that it takes the side of its worst enemy, dogma, and calls it progress." Much more is explained about the extreme danger of pseudo-idealism in chapter 8.16, The Last 200 Years. Thankfully, the arrival of the demystifying, exposing and reconciling true explanation of the human condition has the power to cut short this frightening, death by dogma, left-wing threat to humanity. That is, of course, if humanity accepts this lifeline it has been thrown. And, for its part, the right-wing's need to support the upsetting, often brutal, competition, aggression and selfishness producing battle or war to defy the ignorance of our ideal behaviour demanding, unjustly condemning, moral instinctive self or soul, and find understanding of ourselves, can also come to an end with the acceptance of this liberating insight. Yes, with understanding of the human condition now found, the whole necessary but ugly business of politics can happily come to a close. The explanation of just how the human race can now put down the sword, end its egocentric, must prove that we are good and not bad, warrior existence, and by so doing transform itself into a peaceful state, is explained in the concluding chapter 9 of this book. Chapter 3.10 Free at Last. The end of the political process as we know it is just one example of the great change that can now come to the human race. This is the ultimate future shock, massive paradigm shift for humans. But, as will be explained in some detail in Chapter 9, since this shift is an immensely positive change, the transformation will not only be easy, but fabulously exciting. Indeed, so great is both the amount of change we now face, the future shock, and the self-confronting exposure, the Judgment Day effect mentioned earlier, that I and others established the World Transformation Movement to introduce and help manage the truly wonderful way we are able to manage these huge transitions. It is called the World Transformation Movement because the most fabulous effect of having understanding of the human condition is that all our psychologically upset, angry, egocentric and alienated behaviour can now, immediately, be put aside and eventually completely disappear, thus bringing about the complete rehabilitation and transformation of the human race and thus of our planet. So this is the end of the world as we know it, and the beginning of the world we always hoped for. Indeed, while the socialist, temperance, age of Aquarius, peace, new age, feminist, green, politically correct, postmodernist, multicultural, anti-capitalist movements, and these are only the more recent of the litany of deluded false starts to an ideal world for humans that we have witnessed, have all severely discredited and inhibited the prospect of a truly human condition resolved, psychologically ameliorated, completely transformed new world for humans. One of the founders of the 1980s New Age movement, the author Marilyn Ferguson, did offer this accurate description of the now realised hope of its arrival. Maybe, the Jesuit priest, scientist and philosopher Teilhard de Chardin was right. Maybe we are moving towards an omega point, a final genuine unification or individuation of our split selves, Maybe we can finally resolve the planet's inner conflict between its neurotic self, which we've created and which is unreal, and its real self. Our original, all-sensitive and loving, instinctive, real self knows how to commune, how to create. From everything I've seen, people really urgently want the kind of new beginning that I'm talking about, where humans will live in cooperation instead of competition. Yes, from being selfish, aggressive and competitive, humans can now return to being selfless, loving and cooperative. Our round of departure has ended. T.S. Eliot wonderfully articulated our species' journey from an original, innocent yet ignorant state to a psychologically upset, fallen, corrupted state, and back to an uncorrupted, but this time enlightened state, when he wrote in 1942, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." This journey humanity has been on from soundness and happiness to a weird, soul-disconnected, alienated existence, and then back to a state of soundness, but now a fully conscious, awake soundness, was also recognized by the 4th century BC Chinese sage Chuang-Tzu, when he said that by and by comes a great awakening, and then we shall know that it has all been a great dream. Here below paragraph 308, I have drawn a picture that I have titled Humanity's Journey from Ignorance to Enlightenment, to summarize the horrendously agonizing but awesomely heroic journey that our species has taken from ignorance to enlightenment. From its innocent, happy, cooperatively oriented, selfless and loving infancy and childhood, humanity progressed to the horror of an insecure, upset adolescence where humans had to search for our identity, specifically for understanding of why we lost our innocence and became selfish, aggressive and competitive. But with understanding of the human condition now found, humanity can, at long last, enter the happy, ameliorated, secure and mature state of adulthood. Again, all these stages that the human race has progressed through will be explained and described in some detail in Chapter 8. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream has finally come true. We can now allow freedom to ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, because all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, can join hands and sing, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." Yes, the human race can now, at last, ultimately, finally leave Plato's horrid living tomb or cave of truth-avoiding, alienated, psychotic and neurotic darkness and stand in the warm, healing sunshine of understanding. And to celebrate the completion of the first draft of this book that lets the sunshine in, I have made from golden seashells I found on a beach in Sydney this exciting picture appearing above paragraph 309 that depicts that all-fabulous, liberating and healing sun, which also represents a mandala of the arrival of harmony and happiness. This picture is especially worth seeing in colour in the online version at www.humancondition.com. Its caption reads, "Composed of golden cockle shells, white star limpets and a large scallop shell from a Sydney beach, this collage was made by the author in 2013 to celebrate this time that the human race has dreamed of, and which has now arrived when we can finally leave Plato's dark cave of denial and let the sunshine in." To help fund the world-saving work of the World Transformation Movement, this artwork is for sale for US $5 million. Having now established the fundamental goodness of humans, it finally becomes both possible and psychologically safe to present the fully accountable and thus true scientific explanations for the meaning of existence. for how humans acquired our moral instincts and for how we became conscious when other animals haven't. These answers, as well as a rebuttal of the false accounts that have been put forward to supposedly explain the origins of our moral instincts, are presented in the next 4 chapters of this book. Chapter 6, which contains a rebuttal of the false theories that have been put forward for our moral nature, also provides an account of the ill treatment, even persecution, these human race saving answers have received for 30 years from the mechanistic paradigm. For while our species' journey to enlightenment is complete, this explanation's journey to acceptance is still a work in progress. Since the conscious mind must surely be nature's greatest invention, its failure to fulfill its great potential by not recognizing the psychosis addressing and explaining real explanation of the human condition that has now arrived would represent a failure of the whole story of life on Earth. This resistance, especially by the scientific establishment, to recognize this understanding of the human condition, is an extremely serious matter. The survival of humanity is hanging in the balance, and that balance simply must tip the right way. The final chapters of this book, chapters 8 and 9 respectively, present a description of humanity's journey from ignorance to enlightenment and a description of how the human race is now able to be transformed. A more complete description of this fully accountable human race transforming true biological explanation of the human condition can be found in my freely available online book Freedom Expanded at www.humancondition.com/freedom-expanded.